On the morning of December 16th, 2000, 31-year-old Jerry Michael Mike Williams left his home in Tallahassee, Florida, before dawn. Known to friends and family as a skilled outdoorsman, he was headed for a duck hunting trip at Lake Seminole near the Georgia state line. Before leaving, he assured his wife, Denise, that he would return by noon so they could celebrate their 6th wedding anniversary. Confident in his abilities and familiar with the area, Mike had every reason to expect an ordinary morning on the water. When noon came and went without his return, Denise began making phone calls to friends and family members, searching for any sign of him. Concern grew quickly. Within hours, word had spread that Mike had failed to come home. A search effort was organized, drawing in local law enforcement, volunteers, and members of the community. Among those assisting were Brian Winchester, Mike's longtime best friends in high school, and Brian's father. Search teams located Mike's Ford Bronco parked near the lake. His small boat was also recovered from the water. However, there was no sign of Mike himself. The circumstances were puzzling. The weather had been cold but clear, and Mike was known to be cautious during outdoor activities. Despite intensive efforts over several days, including water searches and shoreline sweeps, no trace of his body was found. For 44 days, the search continued without results. Frustration grew as each lead ended in disappointment. Then, 6 months after Mike's disappearance, a discovery reignited speculation. Investigators recovered his waders, a camouflage hunting jacket, his hunting license, and a flashlight from the waters of Lake Seminole. To some, this reinforced the theory that Mike had suffered a boating accident, fallen into the lake, and drowned. Given the lake's reputation for alligators, it was suggested that his body may have been consumed by them. However, others found the details troubling. Alligators were far less active in colder winter months, and the timing and condition of the recovered items raised quiet questions. Despite this, with no body and no clear evidence of foul play, authorities concluded their investigation, and Mike was declared legally dead. One person, however, could not accept the official explanation. Mike's mother, Cheryl Williams, felt from the beginning that something was deeply wrong. Her instincts told her the circumstances did not add up. Although her doubts were not yet part of the formal investigation, they marked the start of what would become a relentless, years-long fight to uncover the truth. At the time, though, the disappearance of Mike Williams remained officially recorded as a tragic hunting accident. With the case closed and the community left to wonder how such an experienced outdoorsman could vanish without a trace on a familiar lake. From the moment authorities concluded that Mike Williams had drowned and likely been eaten by alligators, Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother, refused to believe it. To her, the story never made sense. Mike was a skilled outdoorsman, familiar with the hazards of Lake Seminole, and the conditions on the day he vanished did not align with what investigators claimed. Cheryl's instincts told her there was more to the story, and she resolved to prove it. She began by collecting every detail she could find. Over time, she compiled 27 pages of handwritten notes, carefully documenting inconsistencies, timelines, and observations. Cheryl also took her fight to the highest office in the state. For 9 years, she wrote a letter every single day to the governor of Florida. By the end of that effort, she had sent 1,472 letters, each one a plea to reopen the case and look deeper into her son's disappearance. Her determination was fueled by facts she uncovered through her own research. One critical piece of information stood out. Alligators do not feed during cold winter months. This directly challenged the theory that Mike's body had been consumed after drowning. The timing of the discovery of his hunting gear, 6 months after he disappeared, also struck her as suspicious. Then there were the financial details. After Mike was declared legally dead, Denise Williams collected $1.75 million from 3 separate life insurance policies. One of those policies, worth $1 million, had been written by Brian Winchester, Mike's longtime best friend, just months before the disappearance. For Cheryl, this connection was impossible to ignore. As years passed, suspicion in the community began to grow, particularly after Denise Williams married Brian Winchester in 2005, 5 years after Mike's disappearance. While some still accepted the official version of events, others began to share Cheryl's belief that the case was far from a tragic accident. Despite repeated setbacks and official resistance, Cheryl never wavered. She attended every meeting, spoke to every reporter who would listen, and continued pressing law enforcement to revisit the evidence. Her relentless pursuit was not driven by speculation, but by documented facts, inconsistencies, and a deep conviction that justice had not been served. Although at this stage the case remained closed, Cheryl's persistence laid the foundation for the truth to emerge years later. Her refusal to accept easy answers kept the memory of her son alive in the public eye and ensured that the questions surrounding his disappearance would never be entirely forgotten. Mike Williams and Denise Merrill first met in high school at North Florida Christian School in Tallahassee, Florida. It was there that they also became close friends with Brian Winchester and his future wife, Kathy Thomas. The four of them formed part of the same social circle, developing relationships that would eventually lead to two sets of high school sweethearts, Mike with Denise and Brian with Kathy. Over the years, the couples remained intertwined through friendship, community, and shared history. By the mid-1990s, both couples were married. Mike and Denise would in 1994 and soon welcomed their daughter, Ansley. Brian and Kathy also built a life together. On the surface, their friendships appeared stable and genuine. Beneath that surface, however, a hidden relationship was beginning to take shape, one that would eventually destroy all of their lives. According to Brian Winchester's later testimony, the affair between him and Denise began on October 13, 1997, during a night out in Tallahassee. The couples attended a concert by the band Sister Hazel. After arriving, Mike and Kathy left to park the car while Brian and Denise entered the club. In that brief time, they shared their first kiss. That same night, they returned to their separate homes but spoke for hours on the phone, engaging in intimate conversation and phone sex. From that point, their relationship escalated quickly. Whenever Mike was at work, traveling for conferences, or otherwise away, Brian and Denise met in secret. They also found ways to see each other during group activities, concealing their intentions under the guise of friendship. On occasion, they traveled together, with Brian joining Mike and Denise on trips, using the opportunity to spend time alone with her. Kathy Winchester would later reveal that not long before Mike's disappearance, she, Brian, and Denise were involved in a sexual encounter. This revelation underscored the depth of betrayal within their marriages and hinted at the complicated dynamics between the four individuals. Over time, Brian and Denise began discussing how they could be together permanently. Divorce, however, was not an option for Denise. She cited her religious beliefs and an unwillingness to share custody of her daughter with Mike as the main reasons. According to Brian's confession, Denise's position was firm. There was only one solution for them to be together. That solution was Mike's death. Their conversations moved from abstract possibilities to concrete plans. Ideas were discussed, including staged accidents, but the focus remained on ensuring that Mike would not survive. These discussions laid the groundwork for a murder plot that, in their minds, would solve their personal problems and secure their future together. By late 2000, the plan had taken shape. Within weeks, it would be set into motion on the waters of Lake Seminole. On the morning of December 16, 2000, Brian Winchester and Mike Williams set out for what was supposed to be a friendly duck hunting trip. The plan, as Brian later confessed, had been carefully crafted in the weeks before. He had told Mike about a secret special spot at Lake Seminole where the hunting was supposedly better. This pretense would lure Mike into an isolated area where Brian could carry out the killing without witnesses. They launched a small aluminum boat in the early hours, the winter air sharp and cold. Mike wore heavy duck hunting gear, a thick jacket, chest waders, and boots. The clothing was meant to protect against the cold water, but Brian knew it could also become deadly if Mike ended up overboard. Once on the lake, Brian steered toward a secluded area away from other hunters. He invited Mike to stand so he could point out the location. As soon as Mike was on his feet, Brian shoved him overboard. His expectation was that the weight of the waterlogged waders and jacket would drag Mike under before he could react. However, the plan did not go as smoothly as Brian anticipated. Mike managed to surface and grabbed onto a partially submerged tree stump, fighting to keep himself above water. At that moment, Brian retrieved a 12-gauge shotgun from the boat and fired at Mike, striking him in the face. Denise Williams was not present at the scene, but Brian later stated during his testimony that she was in my head behind me, implying her influence and involvement in the decision to kill Mike. After the shooting, Brian pulled Mike's body from the water and placed it in his vehicle. He covered the body with a tarp and drove nearly 60 miles to Carr Lake, a remote location far from the initial scene. There, he dug a shallow grave and buried Mike. The entire operation was conducted with calculated precision to prevent discovery. In the hours that followed, Brian returned to Tallahassee and joined the search effort for Mike, portray himself as a concerned friend. He even spoke with authorities, maintaining the appearance of someone eager to find answers. Months later, investigators came to believe that Brian returned to Lake Seminole and planted Mike's hunting gear, waders, a jacket, and his license, to reinforce the idea of an accidental drowning. This, they suspected, was part of a broader plan to help Denise collect on Mike's life insurance policies, totaling $1.75 million. For more than 16 years, the truth about that morning remained hidden. Brian's confession would not come until 2017, finally revealing the cold and deliberate actions that had taken place on that frigid December day. In the years following Mike Williams' disappearance, Denise Williams and Brian Winchester continued the life they had envisioned together. Brian divorced his wife, Kathy Winchester, and in 2005, he married Denise. To outsiders, it appeared the couple had finally achieved what they wanted. But beneath the surface, their marriage was far from stable. From the beginning, both lived under a cloud of paranoia. They feared being watched or overheard, knowing the circumstances of Mike's disappearance could one day draw attention. This constant anxiety strained their relationship. Brian's admitted sex addiction created further tension, eroding trust and intimacy. In 2010, a significant development unsettled them even more. Authorities reclassified Mike's disappearance from a presumed accidental drowning to a suspicious death. This change signaled increased scrutiny, and for the couple, it meant the past they had worked so hard to conceal was now under renewed investigation. By 2012, their marriage had unraveled to the point of separation. Denise and Brian began living apart, though their connection, forged in secrecy and crime, still bound them in complex ways. In 2015, Denise took the decisive step of filing for divorce, a move that Brian resisted. Brian's desperation to prevent the end of their marriage culminated in a dangerous confrontation in August 2016. Early one morning, he concealed himself in the back seat of Denise's SUV, armed with a handgun. When she entered the vehicle, Brian emerged, held her at gunpoint, and threatened to kill himself. He also implied violence toward her if she refused to reconcile. Denise managed to stay calm during the ordeal. She spoke to him in a way that de-escalated the immediate threat, convincing him to allow her to leave safely. Once free, she contacted law enforcement. Brian was arrested and charged with kidnapping, domestic assault, and armed burglary. This incident marked a turning point. For investigators, it was more than a domestic violence case. It provided the leverage they needed. Brian's arrest set in motion the events that would eventually lead to his full confession about Mike Williams' murder. The marriage that began in secrecy and conspiracy ended in public scandal, exposing fractures that had been present from the very start. Brian Winchester's 2016 arrest for kidnapping Denise Williams became the critical break investigators had been waiting for. For years, law enforcement had harbored suspicions about both Brian and Denise. The fact that Brian had married Mike Williams' widow, combined with his involvement in Mike's life insurance policy, had always seemed too convenient to ignore. Now, with Brian in custody facing serious charges, detectives saw an opportunity to pressure him for the truth. Investigators approached both Brian and Denise for interviews. Denise, consistent with her past behavior, refused to cooperate. She maintained her silence, offering no explanation and no statement. Brian, on the other hand, recognized the gravity of his legal situation, facing the possibility of decades in prison for the kidnapping and potential murder charges if new evidence surfaced. He agreed to talk. In a negotiated deal, Brian was offered immunity from prosecution for Mike Williams' murder if he fully cooperated. The arrangement was clear. In exchange for telling investigators everything about the events of December 16th, 2000, and revealing the location of Mike's remains, he would not face a murder trial. Before being sentenced to 20 years in prison for the kidnapping, Brian led authorities to a remote site at Carr Lake, nearly 60 miles from where Mike was last seen. There, in painstaking detail, he recounted how he had lured Mike under the pretense of a duck hunting trip, pushed him into the water, and ultimately shot him. The recovery of Mike's body ended a 17-year search and provided the physical evidence needed to move forward with the prosecution. With Brian's confession in hand, attention turned to Denise. In May 2018, she was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after fact. The arrest shocked many in the Tallahassee community, where Denise had maintained a quiet public life. Despite the mounting evidence, Denise pleaded not guilty and insisted on her innocence. The trial in December 2018 was a high-profile event, drawing widespread media coverage. Brian Winchester took the stand, delivering testimony that was both detailed and damaging. He described a years-long affair with Denise, their plotting of Mike's murder, and their life together afterward. The jury deliberated for just over 8 hours before returning a verdict. Denise Williams was found guilty on all counts. Outside the courtroom, Denise's daughter publicly defended her mother, expressing unwavering belief in her innocence. Nevertheless, the court upheld the verdict, and Denise faced a life sentence for her role in the crime. The confession had not only closed a cold case, but also revealed a tangled web of deceit, greed, and betrayal that had been hidden for nearly 2 decades. For Cheryl Williams, the conclusion of the case was both heartbreaking and deeply validating. Nearly 17 years had passed since the December morning when her son, Mike Williams, vanished during what was believed to be a simple duck hunting trip. Over those years, Cheryl had endured official skepticism, dead ends, and repeated refusals from authorities to reclassify Mike's disappearance as anything other than a tragic accident. Yet, she never stopped pushing. She wrote letters, met with investigators, and kept her son's name alive in the public eye. When Brian Winchester's confession finally brought the truth to light, Cheryl's worst fears were confirmed. The reality that her only son had been murdered in a deliberate, premeditated plot was devastating. But along with the pain came a sense of justice. In 2018, when Denise Williams was convicted on all charges, Cheryl was present in court, witnessing the final moment of a fight she had carried almost entirely on her own. The legal battle did not end there. In 2020, an appellate court overturned Denise's murder conviction, leaving only the conspiracy charge in place. Despite this partial reversal, Cheryl focused on the larger victory. The truth had been revealed, and those responsible had faced the law. In 2021, speaking to the media, Cheryl said, "Michael has justice." She explained that knowing the fact of what happened, and seeing both Brian and Denise held accountable, gave her some measure of peace. "I believe he can rest now," she added, a quiet acknowledgement of the long, exhausting journey. The case left an enduring mark, not only on Cheryl's life, but on the broader Tallahassee community. It exposed a calculated murder committed by the 2 people Mike trusted most, his wife and his best friend. It revealed how greed, secrecy, and betrayal could destroy lives and remain hidden for years. And it proved the value of persistence in solving even the coldest of cases. For Cheryl Williams, justice did not mean erasing the grief or undoing the years of loss. It meant that her son's story had been told in full, and the truth could no longer be buried. Her determination stands as a testament to how one person's refusal to give up can bring even the most hidden crimes into the light. Janine Jones worked as a licensed vocational nurse in the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Behar County Hospital in San Antonio, Texas, during 1981 and 1982. The unit, now part of University Hospital, was responsible for treating some of the most fragile young patients. It was in this setting that troubling signs began to emerge, signs that would later become central to one of the most disturbing cases in American medical history. During Jones's employment, an unusual pattern of medical emergencies and sudden infant deaths appeared. These incidents were not scattered randomly across the schedule. Instead, they repeatedly occurred during her assigned hours, most often between 3 p.m. and 11 p.m. The correlation between her presence and the sharp rise in unexplained crises earned this period an ominous label among hospital staff: the death shift. In October 1981, a fellow nurse noticed that too many babies under Jones's care were dying from conditions that were typically survivable. The anomalies were not small, isolated incidents, but consistent irregularities that alarmed those working in the intensive care unit. The matter was taken to the head nurse, and an internal inquiry was launched. The findings were striking. Janine Jones had been present during every one of the questionable deaths. Despite such damning results, The hospital did not involve law enforcement. Instead, administrators quietly reassigned Jones under the guise of staffing changes. The pediatric ICU was formally moved to an all-registered nurse staff, and Jones, an LVN, was dismissed. To conceal suspicion, the hospital even provided her with favorable recommendation. In January 1983, senior physicians held a meeting to discuss the unfolding situation. Records later revealed that they decided not to disclose their knowledge to outside authorities. Their inaction was compounded by the destruction of critical medical evidence. Tons of hospital records were shredded, despite a preservation order. Prosecutors later explained that this act crippled their ability to pursue charges in dozens of cases, leaving many suspected deaths unresolved. Investigators would later allege that Jones used powerful drugs, including digoxin, heparin, and muscle relaxants, secretly injecting children with fatal overdoses. These suspicions marked the beginning of a dark saga that continued long after her departure. After leaving Behar County Hospital, Janine Jones found employment at a small pediatric clinic in Kerrville, Texas. The change of setting did not end the troubling pattern of medical emergencies. Once again, children under her care began suffering unexpected crises, many of them fatal. What had been whispered suspicions in San Antonio soon became undeniable reality in Kerrville. The pivotal case occurred in September 1982 with the death of 15-month-old Chelsea and McClellan. Chelsea had been taken to the clinic for a routine vaccination. Jones administered the injection, but within a short time, Chelsea began seizing. She was rushed toward a hospital in San Antonio, but before reaching the facility, she went into cardiac arrest. Despite resuscitation efforts, Chelsea died. Dr. Kathleen Holland, who ran the clinic and worked alongside Jones, was deeply unsettled by the incident. She ordered tests, which revealed traces of succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant, in Chelsea's body. This drug causes paralysis and respiratory failure if administered improperly. The discovery prompted Holland to check the clinic's medication supply. She found a bottle of succinylcholine that had been tampered with. Needle punctures in the lid showed it had been accessed without authorization. Even more suspicious, part of the missing drug had been replaced with saline solution in an attempt to disguise the theft. Only 2 people had access to that medication, Dr. Holland herself and Janine Jones. The evidence pointed clearly toward Jones. Acting swiftly, Holland dismissed her from the clinic and reported her suspicions to authorities. Investigators reviewed other recent child cases and soon uncovered a wider pattern. By 1984, prosecutors brought Jones to trial. She was charged with the murder of Chelsea McClellan, convicted, and sentenced to 99 years in prison. Later that same year, she faced another trial for the January 1982 poisoning of 4-week-old Rolando Santos. Rolando had been injected with heparin, a blood thinner, but survived the ordeal. Jones was convicted of injuring a child and received a concurrent 60-year sentence. Prosecutors argued that Jones may have deliberately created emergencies to cast herself as a miracle working nurse or to demonstrate the need for an intensive care unit. Whatever the motive, the convictions marked the first time authorities directly confronted her actions. For the families of victims, it was a beginning of long-awaited accountability. Decades after her convictions, Janine Jones's name returned to public attention in a way that alarmed families and prosecutors alike. A Texas law, designed to ease prison overcrowding, allowed inmates to earn good time credits that reduced their sentences. Under this statute, Jones was scheduled for mandatory release in March 2018. Despite having been sentenced to decades in prison for murder and child injury, having served just 1/3 of her original sentence, she was preparing to walk free. For the families of her victims, the news was devastating. Among those most horrified was Petty McClellan, mother of 15-month-old Chelsea, whose murder had led to Jones's first conviction. Petty, unwilling to accept the possibility that Jones might soon return to society, launched a campaign to prevent her release. She joined forces with victims advocate Andy Kahan, who had long worked on criminal justice reform and support for families. Together, they raised public awareness and pressured authorities to reopen old cases tied to Jones's history. In 2014, District Attorney Nico LaHood was elected in Behar County. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, he committed his office to preventing Jones from leaving prison. LaHood established a specialized task force to revisit the allegations surrounding the unexplained deaths of infants decades earlier. Assistant District Attorney Jason Goss, who had not even been born when many of the crimes occurred, took charge of the renewed investigation. Goss combed through courthouse archives and surviving files, working to reconstruct cases long hindered by time and by the destruction of hospital records. Though the absence of critical medical charts presented enormous obstacles, the team pressed forward. Their efforts, combined with the persistence of families, kept the pursuit of justice alive and set the stage for the next chapter in the long legal battle. In the painstaking process of rebuilding a case against Genene Jones decades after her original conviction, prosecutors uncovered what they would later describe as a smoking gun. While many hospital records from the 1980s had vanished, one document survived the passage of time and proved pivotal. In 2011, Jones had written a letter to the Texas Board of Nursing, seeking to explain her past and expressing remorse. Within that letter, she admitted to having committed heinous acts and acknowledged the terrible harm she had inflicted. Though she stopped short of naming any individual victims, her language conveyed more than vague regret. It read as a tacit confession. For District Attorney Nico LaHood and Assistant District Attorney Jason Goss, this letter became a cornerstone in their renewed prosecution efforts. It offered, in Jones's own words, an admission of guilt that prosecutors could point to as evidence of her responsibility for the deaths of children under her care. Alongside the letter, investigators highlighted earlier statements Jones had made in prison. In a 1998 interview with a parole officer, she was reported to have said bluntly, "I really did kill those babies." These chilling words, though made informally, reinforced the conclusion that Jones herself had acknowledged the crimes long after her conviction. LaHood anticipated that Jones's defense team would challenge the admissibility of both the letter and the prison interview, arguing that they were either too ambiguous or improperly obtained. Still, he and his team were determined to present them to a jury. In the absence of direct medical records, these self-incriminating remarks provided a powerful alternative, breathing new life into cases once thought impossible to prosecute. By the mid-2010s, the case against Genene Jones was no longer confined to suspicion and whispers. In 2017, the Bexar County District Attorney's Office unveiled a dramatic turn. Jones was formally charged with the murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer, who had died in December 1981 after receiving a massive and unexplained overdose of Dilantin, a powerful anti-seizure medication. For decades, Joshua's death had remained one of the many unexplained tragedies shadowing Jones's career, but modern forensic reviews and renewed investigative efforts gave prosecutors the confidence to bring the charge forward. The momentum did not stop there. Over the following months, Jones faced 4 additional indictments tied to the deaths of infants Richard "Ricky" Nelson, Rosemary Vega, Paul Villarreal, and Patrick Zavala, all of whom had died while under her care between 1981 and 1982. Each indictment was paired with a $1 million bond, effectively guaranteeing that Jones would not walk free once her original sentence expired. Families who had lived with unanswered questions for decades were finally presented with a path toward justice. Initially, Jones pleaded not guilty to all charges. Her defense signaled its readiness to challenge the evidence, highlighting the age of the cases and the difficulty of proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt nearly 40 years later. Prosecutors, however, countered with a formidable arsenal: hospital records, testimony from medical experts, and nearly 200 potential witnesses who were prepared to testify about Jones's history of suspicious behavior, sudden patient declines, and her own incriminating statements. As the January 2020 trial date drew closer, Jones abruptly shifted her stance. Facing the overwhelming scope of evidence and the possibility of multiple consecutive life sentences, she chose to accept a plea deal. In January, she pleaded guilty to the murder of Joshua Sawyer, while 4 other indictments were dismissed as part of the agreement. The decision stunned some observers, but brought a measure of closure to families who had waited decades for answers. During the sentencing hearing, relatives of the victims delivered emotional impact statements that underscored the devastation Jones had inflicted. Mothers spoke directly to her, their voices breaking with grief and rage. One parent told the court that every milestone, birthdays, graduations, weddings, was forever lost because of Jones's actions. Another described the cruel irony of entrusting their baby to someone sworn to provide care, only to have that trust betrayed in the most horrifying way. The presiding judge acknowledged their pain, stating that no sentence could ever restore the lives lost or erase the suffering endured by the families. Still, the court emphasized that the plea ensured Jones would spend the rest of her life in prison, far removed from vulnerable children. Under the terms of the deal, Jones received a life sentence and will not be eligible for parole until 2038. By then, she will be 87 years old, an age that makes the prospect of her release unlikely. For prosecutors, this outcome represented the closest possible measure of justice. District Attorney Nico LaHood expresses hope that Jones would never leave prison alive, ensuring that no other family would suffer at her hands again. For the families, the moment was bittersweet. Justice had come late, but it had come at last. As of today, Janine Jones remains incarcerated, serving her life sentence. Now an elderly woman in failing health, she is expected to die behind bars. After decades of uncertainty, her guilty plea in 2020 finally ensured that she would never walk free again. For many of the families whose children died under her care, this outcome represented long-awaited justice, though the pain of their loss has never diminished. Parents described the guilty plea as both a relief and a torment. Relief that Jones would never harm another child, and torment that it had taken nearly 4 decades to reach this point. The case left deep scars on families who were forced to grieve in silence for years. Several parents, including Petty McClellan and Juanita Villarreal, did not live long enough to see Jones held fully accountable. For others, the drawn-out legal battle added layers of frustration and anguish as they fought tirelessly against a system that had once failed to protect their children. Beyond the families, the Jones case has had a lasting impact on the medical and legal communities. It exposed glaring systemic failures, destroyed evidence, hospital administrators who prioritize reputation over safety, and prosecutors who struggled for years to gather enough proof for conviction. These shortcomings meant that Jones was able to continue working with children for far too long, with devastating consequences. Prosecutors emphasized that the plea deal was the only practical way to guarantee Jones will remain incarcerated until the end of her life. While some criticized the dismissal of multiple charges, officials argued that securing her permanent imprisonment was more important than risking acquittal in a complex trial nearly 40 years after crimes. The legacy of the case is sobering. It reflects the extraordinary persistence of grieving families, the consequences of institutional cover-ups, and the chilling reality of how one nurse betrayed her duty of care to harm society's most vulnerable. For many, Janine Jones will forever be remembered as a reminder of the devastating consequences when oversight and accountability fail. This case is a chilling reminder of how long justice can be delayed, but also how persistence can finally bring the truth to light. The families may never fully heal, yet their fight ensured that Janine Jones will never harm another child again. If you found this story powerful, do not forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime documentaries. Your support helps us continue uncovering stories that must never be forgotten.